On the 19th of November 1992, two little boys aged 4 and 6 knocked on the door of a lone house near to Cobb County in Georgia. The homeowner opened up the door and he found the two little boys staring back up at him, covered in blood. The eldest of the two boys said, quote, "A bad man shot my mum with a pirate gun." This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Sarah Ambrusco. The homeowner was obviously completely shocked to find these two little boys at his front door, especially with what the eldest one had said and the fact they were completely covered in blood. He called his friend to help, and the two of them rushed immediately to the site where the boys said the car was. They arrived at this car, which was in the middle of a field, and inside they found the body of a young woman. Although it was hard to tell, the attack had been brutal and there was no way of recognising the features on her face. Police officers soon arrived and they identified the woman by means of the boy's testimony and also the fact that her ID was in her purse, which was in the car. Now, the fact that her ID was still in the car with her purse and the keys were in the ignition meant the police could pretty quickly rule out any sort of suspicion that it was a robbery. The fact that her two sons had been found with her, essentially, was tricky for police. They then asked the question, who would have wanted to abduct this woman and then kill her with her two children present? And that was a question that the officers would soon have the answer to, as soon as they started digging into who this woman was. Sarah Ambrusco was born into a family of 7 girls in New York, and she and her siblings were extremely close. And even as they progressed from childhood into their adult years, and they would move across the state, out of state even, across the country, into other cities, they would still remain extremely close. And Sarah had been living as an elementary teacher in Florida before she relocated to go and marry in one of the suburbs of Atlanta. When she arrived there, she actually quit teaching children and she started teaching aerobics at her husband's club. She did enjoy this life for a time, but things weren't right in her marriage and she and her husband ended up divorcing by the time she was 30. But she wanted to stay close by. She built a life for herself here and she quickly gained a job as marketing director at an exclusive club called Elan. Working at that club meant that every day Sarah was surrounded by people who were younger than her. They were people in their early to mid-20s coming into the club and she began to feel quite old. She was only 31, but she was acutely aware that she didn't have a husband, she didn't have a partner, she didn't have any children, and she was really, really upset about that. Her sort of life's goal was to have children, and that's all she cared about at this point in her life. She decided that whoever she was going to settle down with next would need to be on board for having children with her, and it would need to be soon. And then one night, after a long day at work, Sarah arrived home and she sat in front of the TV and turned it on. And the news was playing and it was reporting on a brutal murder of a lawyer in Atlanta. And she saw the junior prosecutor assisting on the case was a man that she actually knew. His name was Frederick Tokars, although she knew him as Fred. She hadn't seen him in years, the two knew each other from when they were younger. But she found herself suddenly at the phone dialing his number, and before she knew it, he'd answered, and the two were in quite an engaging conversation. And they really got on this initial phone call, and they decided that actually they should go on a date. Things went well on that first date. Fred reminded Sarah of home. He reminded her of his childhood. He felt safe and secure. And it really wasn't long before those first few dates turned into weeks and months, and then the two were in a pretty solid relationship. In fact, they got married within a year, and then Sarah got pregnant and she gave birth to a little boy called Ricky. After that, Fred quit his job and he actually started up his own law practice. Now, this was a little bit worrying for Sarah. She had married Fred, who had been at this established law firm for a number of years, and he had quit that to start up his own, which, although it was a risk, Sarah supported her husband in. And while he was there, he became the subject of some federal investigations. He was doing some seemingly quite dodgy things. For one thing, he wrote an article stating that sometimes attorneys could accidentally launder money for their clients without even knowing it because of some laws that had recently changed. And Sarah noticed more often than not, when Fred was defending criminals, he was paid in cash. But around the time that Fred was being looked into by federal investigators, nightlife in Atlanta was declining and Sarah actually lost her job as marketing director. And she knew that the family needed money to maintain this lifestyle that she'd been accustomed to. So she sort of couldn't say much about Fred doing these seemingly quite suspicious things. And around this time, Fred became controlling, especially with regards to finances. He insisted that he needed to be in charge of all of the family's finances. He would give Sarah a monthly allowance, but it wasn't very much, especially considering that she was bringing up a child and all of the child's expenses, all of Ricky's expenses, had to come out of the money that Sarah was allocated. And Fred had made an area of the house completely off limits to Sarah. That was the basement area. And that was where he kept the safe and also a number of secretive files. On top of that, Fred rarely came home from work on time. He often would arrive in the early hours of the next morning, just stating that he had to work late. But Sarah knew that probably wasn't the case. And on top of this, Fred became emotionally and physically abusive. But as with many couples and families, when things become tricky or ultimately unhealthy, the two would present to the outside world as if they had a happy marriage where they actually experienced very few problems. And then in 1988, Sarah gave birth to another little boy who she called Michael. It wasn't long after the birth of Michael that Sarah became convinced Fred was cheating on her. And she did confront him about it, but ultimately he denied it, and he made it very clear that if she tried to do anything about it, if she tried to divorce him, then he would absolutely take the children from her. And he said that because of all these contacts he had in law and in that sort of world, it would be very easy for him to do that. Now, Sarah was smart. She knew that that might not be the case, but she couldn't be sure. So she actually hired a private detective to look into Fred and find a way for her to make sure that if they did divorce, she would get the children. And then one afternoon, Sarah called the private detective and asked him to come round to her house. She had broken into Fred's basement, and what she found, she thought was damning. She had managed to break into the safe, and she'd found documents, bags and pills that she thought were criminalising. But the private detective said that there was nothing he could do. She had broken in, and if they were to take anything, it would be stealing and they wouldn't be able to use it. He said that the best thing for her to do was call the police, get them round here and get them to take the things. And even though it wasn't apparent at the time, it later became clear that some of those documents were proof that Fred was laundering money to some offshore bank accounts for his drug dealing clients. Unfortunately, although there was a lot of evidence against Fred, especially with regards to the affair he was having, Sarah was just too scared to divorce him. She didn't know that she would definitely get the children and she couldn't risk not having custody of them. So she decided to wait it out. She stayed home, raising Ricky and Michael, and she even got a puppy for them who they called Jake. Now, Jake, the puppy, would actually become a bit of a lifesaver over that next Thanksgiving period. One night, Sarah was asleep in bed with her two sons. Fred was away that night on a work trip. And she heard the dog Jake barking frantically and going a bit wild downstairs. Now, by the time she actually went to investigate it, the dog had calmed down and everything seemed to be fine. But what they learnt later throughout the investigation of this case was that it was actually very serious and very dangerous, and it's likely that Jake barking scared off this perpetrator and saved Sarah's life. What she didn't know at the time was that 22-year-old small-time criminal Curtis Alfonso Roa had been at the house that night. He was actually out on probation, and he and another man, Eddie Lawrence, had gone to that house that night with the plan of killing Sarah. It's alleged that Eddie actually offered to pay Curtis $5,000 to kill Sarah. Eddie knew things about the house, things that only someone familiar with that house would have known. He knew that Fred wouldn't be home. He knew that Sarah and her two sons would be there sleeping together. He knew that the burglar alarm had been experiencing problems over the last few weeks and so had been turned off. And most importantly, He knew that the outside door on the back of the house had the lock broken and it hadn't been fixed yet, so it was easily accessible to anyone who wanted to get inside from the outside. Eddie Lawrence, the man who had all of this information and had promised to pay Curtis, was Fred's business partner. Eddie Lawrence was known to law enforcement. He was a drug dealer who would often buy property and then rent it out, and he often found himself in interrogation rooms. A lot of his time in those interrogation rooms would be to do with the property that he'd been buying and then renting out. And in those early days of being in police custody, he sought the help of Fred. The two got on very well, and actually in 1990 they decided to go into business together and decided to run a club called the Parrot Club. The Parrot was a nightclub that had initially been run by Fred and two other men, Billy Carter and James Mason. These two men, according to federal court documents, were acting as frontmen for two other men who couldn't own this Parrot Club because of their criminal records. One of those men was Eddie Lawrence. On the 29th of November 1992, Sarah had been hanging out at her parents' house with her two young sons, Ricky and Michael. It was around 10 p.m. when the three of them returned to their home. Now, Fred wasn't there. He was away on work, as per usual, and they had arrived back home in the car, and Sarah and Ricky had gone towards the front door, and Michael was still asleep on the back seat. And so Sarah and Ricky and Jake the dog were making their way to the front door when Sarah saw a man in a black beanie hat approach them. He had a sawed-off shotgun and he ordered them to get back inside the car and for Sarah to sit in the driver's seat and turn the ignition on and start driving. The man had kicked the dog out of the way and climbed in behind Sarah, and at this point he pointed the gun towards her head. Michael was still fast asleep next to him, and Sarah just begged him in whispered tones not to hurt her or the children. She said he'd do whatever he needed. She offered him the car, she offered him her purse. She said whatever it would take for him to let them go, she would do. He told Sarah to just keep driving, and then about half a mile from the house, he ordered her to pull down a little street and stop. There was some sort of commotion, and in a panic, the man in the back seat pulled the trigger. He then jumped out of the car, and the car continued rolling forward slightly, and the two little boys were still in the car with their dead mum, and the car rolled forward and eventually did come to a stop. And that's when Ricky, the older of the two boys, pulled his brother Michael towards him, pulled him out of the car, and they made their way over the field to that lone house in the distance. They knocked on the door, the homeowner answered, and he found these two brothers, these two little boys, staring up at him, covered in blood. Ricky said, quote, "A bad man shot my mum with a pirate gun." The police arrived and they identified Sarah quickly. And they also realised that she was the wife of someone who was already sort of on their radar, Fred Tokars. Back at the crime scene of the car, there were a few fingerprints, but there wasn't a whole lot of forensic evidence. Back in 1992, it certainly wasn't impossible, but it was more difficult to link DNA and forensics in the way that we can today. And in the car, they couldn't find anything really that they could use. It was clear that this crime had been committed efficiently and quickly. Now, the car didn't give many clues, but the crime scene back at the house did. Firstly, the back door handle had been reversed, a clear way to make it completely accessible to anyone from the outside world. And on top of that, officers soon learnt from Sarah's family and friends that she was having trouble at home and her marriage life was difficult. When officers interviewed Fred, they noticed pretty early on that he actually smelt of alcohol. And when they asked him and his lawyer why this was, his lawyer said that his client had just been a bit nervous and he gave him a couple of beers to calm his nerves. He said his client was in a state of shock and absolute devastation, and that's why he'd done it. But this was obviously a bit odd to officers. The lawyer and Fred knew that he would be asked a number of really important and very time-critical questions. These details would be imperative to the investigation, and for Fred to have had a couple of beers would definitely hinder it and not help the investigation. As for what Fred thought had happened, he was adamant that it had just been a random act of violence. It happened all the time in Atlanta, But this wasn't Atlanta, this was Cobb County. And random acts of violence almost never happen there. Acts of violence never happen there, never mind some seemingly random act. Officers thought it was odd how seemingly uninterested he was in solving or helping to solve his wife's murder. Fred made sure to back himself up before anyone could sort of point the finger at him, and he told the media that he and his wife were having marital issues. He even said that he'd been aware that Sarah had hired this private detective to look into him and that he was having an affair, but he said that he and Sarah had sorted things out and were back on track by the time of her murder. But the detectives were doing research alongside Fred, and they found out, in fact it didn't take them long to find out, the massive undertakings he had with the criminal underworld. When the detectives told Fred they knew what he'd been up to, and they actually showed him a photo of his business partner Eddie Lawrence, Fred just stopped talking. But the detectives continued, saying they knew he'd put out a hit on Sarah. They clarified they knew that he had put out a hit now and he had to have it done now because he was aware that one of his clients' wives had just been called to testify in a trial that was happening. In this money laundering trial, he knew that it was only a matter of time before Sarah was called to testify. And if she was, there was no telling how much information she'd give up. She was keen to divorce Fred, and this could be a really simple way out for her. So they knew that that was why he'd ordered the hit now. Despite all of this, officers just didn't have enough evidence to keep Fred, and so they had to release him. They had to let him go whilst they built his case. And meanwhile, Fred took his two sons and fled the country across the border to Canada. Sarah's family were desperately trying to get custody of Ricky and Michael. They had no doubt that Fred was responsible for Sarah's murder, but at this point, there wasn't a huge amount that they could do, even though they knew how dangerous it was for them to be in their dad's custody. Whilst in Canada, Fred could see that the end was near. He knew that he didn't have much time left, and he actually attempted to take his own life. But on failing that, he was brought back to the US and he was charged with money laundering and for the murder of Sarah. The case went to trial, and it turned out there was quite a lot of evidence against Fred. Before Sarah's death, Fred had taken out life insurance policies, and they actually amounted to $1.75 million if they'd all been paid out. He desperately needed that money. He'd been accused of $700,000 just going missing from one of his drug dealing clients. And the man who had allegedly pulled the trigger, Curtis Alfonso Roa, had used that $5,000 that he'd been paid to buy drugs, and he had not been shy about telling everyone he met over the next couple of days or dealt with over the next couple of days exactly what had happened. Over the weeks and months following the murder, a number of Curtis's friends and associates were questioned, and the officers began to build their case against Fred, Curtis and Eddie. Curtis was not up for denying what had happened. He told too many people, and so he ended up admitting to what had happened to officers. A statement to his then girlfriend corroborated his version of events, but his lawyer said that he didn't actually pull the trigger, and it was Eddie Lawrence who had killed Sarah. Another link that came to light during the trial was that the woman who Fred was having the affair with was actually one of Eddie's employees. That same employee testified that Fred had said to her that he was sick and tired of his marriage and he was done with Sarah. He'd added that he wanted to find a way to get rid of her. Over the years of business partnerships together, Eddie ended up owing Fred around $70,000. It was money that he just didn't have, and so Fred actually ended up telling Eddie that if he killed his wife, he would write off that entire debt and he'd give him an extra $25,000. Eddie eventually agreed, although he decided that he couldn't commit the murder himself. He knew Sarah. He'd been round the house for dinner, she'd cooked for him, and so he decided he had to employ someone else to do the actual murder. He decided to hire Curtis, who he knew wouldn't say no to the job. It's not like Curtis had killed before, but he had a drug addiction and he needed the money, and Eddie knew that. Curtis's first trial ended in a mistrial, and during that time, Eddie actually took a plea deal. That meant that despite being the actual person who had done the hiring of the hitman and sort of being the go-between the whole time, Eddie was only sentenced to 12 years for his role in the crime. Sarah's family pushed for Fred to receive the death sentence, but ultimately he was sentenced to life in prison for both the money laundering charges and Sarah's murder and other charges. So he ended up getting 4 life sentences. In 1999, Fred was transferred to a Wisconsin prison where he met a man called Robert Ortloff. Whilst in that prison, he and Robert became quite good friends and, I suppose, acquaintances. And during that time, they spoke a lot. And in July of that year, Fred told officers that Robert had confessed to him that he had killed a 20-year-old woman called Kathleen Smith back in 1984. Fred said of Robert, quote, "He finally admitted that yes, I was involved, but it was an accident. I didn't mean to do it and I had to cover it up." Robert allegedly said he did this because of jealousy and money. Although Fred said that another time, Robert had told him that he had planned to do it and that he'd done that by bringing a rope with him, but it just hadn't gone that way. He'd panicked and he'd ended up hitting her over the head. Fred's testimony was integral in that trial and the subsequent verdict. I covered that case in last week's episode of Red Rum, so if you didn't see it, check it out and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes below. Even so, the most Fred got for his testimony was exactly what he'd asked for. It was a place in witness protection and a placement at another prison, a different one that he had chosen. Fred suffered from MS and in 2020 he died at the age of 67. Ricky and Michael were raised by Sarah's sister and mum and dad in Florida before her mum's death in 1998 and her dad's death in 2002. Her parents were eventually buried in the same place as Sarah, in New York. Sarah's sister continued to raise Ricky and Michael before Ricky actually went to San Diego to study to be an emergency medical technician. And Sarah's youngest son graduated from Columbia, but unfortunately in 2020 he suffered a pulmonary embolism and passed away. He's also been buried in the same plot as Sarah. Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. We'll be doing some episodes like this where there's maybe a few less pictures and video material, and then we'll be doing some regular episodes too. So keep an eye out for those. If you liked it, please click the thumbs up button. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. Let me know if you've got any case suggestions down below too. And I'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Goodbye.